Joining us today is Kelsey Stokes, a medical device attorney with the law firm of Fleming, Nolan and Jez out of Houston, Texas. Very honored to have you here on the show today. I've had the privilege of going to trial with you. You're one of the best in the business. Really excited to have you on.
Thank you so much, Caleb. I'm so honored to be on this show. I'm a real fan. I don't know if the viewers know, but your shirts, America's Lawyer shirts, they're very comfortable. I wear them everywhere. So I'm very honored to be on this show. Yeah, medical devices are a unique animal. They're different from drugs in the sense of the regulations that govern them. In a lot of ways, medical devices are like the Wild West, and it's actually really disturbing to most people who make the mistake of striking up a conversation with me and ask me what I do for a living. Inevitably, somebody will have a knee implant and they'll say, well, wait a second, I thought that these devices were approved by the FDA. I thought they were safe. And I then have to tell them, actually, not so much. So the way that devices enter the market, if they are considered a class 2 device. So most implantable devices are class 2 devices. And what that means is in order to get onto the market, the manufacturer just has to show that that device is substantially equivalent to a device that's already on the market. Now, the device that's called the predicate device, and it's essentially, it piggybacks off of an earlier device. What's disturbing about it is that these manufacturers can piggyback off of devices that entered the market before 1976. And that's important because if they were on the market before the Medical Device Amendments Act, the Medical Device Act of 1976, then they could get grandfathered in. In other words, no safety testing, no clinical trials, nothing. They get grandfathered in. And so a manufacturer in 2025 can actually claim that they are substantially equivalent to a device that dates all the way back to a pre-1976 device.
Well, and that's got to be shocking to so many viewers is that, things that are coming out, as you said, in 2025 are purposely saying in documents to the United States government, oh, we're substantially the same as a device that existed in the early 70s so that it predates the regulations that provide safety for all of us.
Oh, that's right. And what's even more disturbing is that predicate device can be a device that was recalled from the market. So devices that are being implanted into human beings intended for permanent implantation trace back in many instances to a recalled device. It's very disturbing. Also disturbing is when I talk to surgeons, they are shocked. They are shocked to hear that the FDA does not, quote, approve the devices, and in fact, they're only cleared. The other significant thing to know about that, Caleb, is that when a device is 510K cleared, it does not speak to safety or efficacy. The only thing that speaks to safety or efficacy are when a company goes through what's known as the pre-market approval process, or PMA, and that's when the device is classified as a class 3. So if it is a 510K device, again, no requirement for human testing, no requirement that it be tested for safety or efficacy, as long as it's similar to something that's been on the market since the 70s. I will also say something that is very misunderstood is the concept of withdrawals, the concept of recalls. The FDA is only as good as what the manufacturer gives them. And they rely on adverse event reports, and that system is flawed. The other thing is companies will just stop making devices. So for example, many people think that the transvaginal mesh devices that were used to treat pelvic organ prolapse, that those were actually recalled from the market, but they weren't. In fact, the FDA in 2016 changed the classification from a class 2 to a class 3 device, which required them to go through more rigorous testing. And in 2018, by their deadline that the FDA gave them, all of the manufacturers of transvaginal mesh used to treat pelvic organ prolapse stopped manufacturing them. The reason? Because they couldn't pass the stringent testing requirements. And that's what's disturbing, is if these class 2 devices were actually elevated by FDA to class 3, then I would guarantee you, Caleb, that the majority of them would not actually be on the market because they wouldn't be able to pass the rigorous safety tests.
Well, and so many people tell me, well, if it wasn't safe, then somebody would say something. And you mentioned the post-market surveillance or the reporting that comes into the FDA. And there's a whole host of issues that people may not be aware of regarding that process. So first of all, anybody can go on the FDA's website and kind of Google their version of a Google search of these reports. And very quickly, if you look at a few of them, you'll start to see that this data is all over the place. First of all, most of it is reported by the manufacturers themselves. And obviously, they're getting to write the narrative of why this failed. And because they're writing the narrative, they're putting the bulk of these failures on the surgeons themselves. They're saying it's mostly user error, not our product's fault, which is a problem because they trained the surgeons how to use your device. And then secondly, they're miscoding, right? So they're using codes, different codes for the same thing, so the FDA can't see trends.
That's right, Caleb. So even if a surgeon or a hospital facility actually makes a complaint, sends it to the manufacturer actually gets to analyze it before it does anything else with it. And the majority of the time, they don't even actually investigate the device. And the reason they'll give many reasons, but one of them is that it's too dangerous. It's a biohazard. They don't want to see the specimen. It's called a gross specimen that comes back, and so there's just not enough information to determine whether or not it was actually a device malfunction, and so then that doesn't get reported. 9 times out of 10, they'll in fact, actually more than that, 99.9% of the time, these manufacturers will say it's a user error. In other words, it's the fault of the surgeon. And then that does not get reported as an adverse event or a malfunction of the device. What's probably most disturbing, Caleb, is the way that these companies basically cook the books on the rate of the complications of these devices. So you remember from math class, the numerator of a fraction is the top, the denominator is the bottom. If you have in the denominator a really large number and you have in the numerator a really small number, then that percentage or that rate is going to be tiny. So what they do is for the numerator, they take a malfunction and they look only within the lot. And lot numbers for devices, they can be as small as 16 devices per lot, sometimes a couple of hundred. And so they look to see if there's a same or similar, and that's also a term of art, right? Like, what does that even mean, right? And so they look to see, is there anything like that in this tiny lot? And the answer is usually no. And so they take this tiny number on the top and then they divide it by the denominator, which is global cells. Global cells. That's not even the number of devices that get implanted into human beings. That's the number of devices that are actually sitting on the shelf. So numerator, tiny number, denominator, the biggest number you could actually have, and that's how they report their complaint rates. So surgeons have no idea the true complaint rate for these devices.
Well, and this is all just the few that are actually making it to be reported, because in the United States, it's not mandatory that the hospital or the doctor or anybody report any of this information. So it's only a tiny fraction that is being reported, and then of that tiny fraction that's being reported, they're cooking the books and making it to where it's impossible almost to find useful trends if they had been a neutral party or been an honest actor, quite frankly, and just reporting raw data as opposed to changing it, like you said, with the numerator and the denominator, or changing classifications. Certainly in our litigation, we've seen people, a seroma is a specific medical diagnosis of fluid, right, surrounding an area. But then they'll use another diagnosis that's not supported anywhere in the medical literature that has that same problem. So now you have 2 reported this way and 2 reported that way. So somebody just searching, or the FDA looking for trends, the data, garbage in, garbage out. And so
Right.
You can't see the safety trends to trigger a recall or further investigation.
Exactly. And the name of the game is hiding the trend. And you just hit the nail on the head. When they call an injury something by one name, they'll call it in one event, adverse event, they'll call it by another name and another. And so it's difficult for anybody looking to actually figure out a trend. Another thing they do, Caleb, is a lot of these companies have subsidiaries, or they might have a branch of the company that manufactures like a part of the device, and that's named a different company. And so for any given medical device, there might be 6 or 7 different company names, or maybe over time it was the one company was acquired by another. They use different company names as the actual manufacturer of the product to, again, avoid the trends. You mentioned the United States. The United States, one of our downfalls is that we don't have a registry process. Surgeons just voluntarily, they can voluntarily submit a report to FDA, but surgeons are busy. And oftentimes they don't know what was implanted in an individual, because an individual who comes to them with a complaint or with a horrible injury due to these devices isn't going to the surgeon who implanted it. So they don't even know what device they're reporting the adverse event for. Countries like Denmark, for example, who actually have registries that they track the device. Every single device is tracked. Countries like Denmark have actually removed certain surgical meshes from the market because of the high adverse event reports. So again, if the rates were actually what reflected what was happening in human beings, it would be a very different picture, and a lot of devices would be recalled in my mind.
Well, and not only are surgeons hesitant because they're busy to report this stuff, they also don't want the record to reflect, because if you know most of the time they're going to say it's the surgeon's fault, why would you report it? So now you're making a paper trail that you messed up according to the manufacturer. They may be opening themselves up to some sort of lawsuit or something of that nature, and then the patient wrongfully thinks, well, the manufacturer said it was the surgeon's fault. But they say that for every surgeon, or almost every surgeon.
User error. If you look at the reports, it's like a broken record. User error, user error, user error. And you're right. Surgeons don't want that associated with them. So there's perverse incentives all the way around.
Well, and it's shocking to me with all the data, and we've talked on this show a bunch about AI, there doesn't seem to be any efforts to make this system better in the United States. To your point, we've seen in litigation where other countries, developed countries, have withdrawn these devices from the market, but they're still being implanted in American citizens because we don't have the tracking metrics that they do. We haven't even talked about the fact that a lot of these companies pay doctors to write reports regarding the safety of the device. And then that is used by future doctors. It says, oh, Dr. So-and-so says it's safe. What they don't disclose is he's made $2 million, or he also owns a patent with this manufacturer. The conflicts of interest are insane in this industry.
Oh, it is. And, the medical literature, even in reputable journals, it is almost invariably sponsored by the industry. And it's always amazing when you look at the literature that the device that does the best in any given piece of literature is usually the device that has that little conflict statement at the bottom where it was sponsored by that company. So yeah, the system is flawed, and frankly, I don't know what else we can do other than to continue to fight. That's what happened in transvaginal mesh, is we just continued to fight, and finally FDA changed the classification to class 3. And because nobody could actually comply with the rigorous safety requirements, it got removed from the market. That's the only thing that I know to do, Caleb, because I just don't know how the system changes otherwise.
Well, and certainly, in litigation that we've been involved in, once the lawsuit is filed, a lot of people start realizing, hey, my injury was actually caused by that device, because it may not be, localized pain. It may be pain throughout the body. It may be weird side effects that they don't know. And until the public is made aware, we all trust that it's our doctors and our government are going to protect us. And it's simply not true. It's simply not happening in this space.
It's not. And another point is there's this now I don't mean to get too in the weeds on the law here, but there's a principle in the law called the learned intermediary, and that's what most manufacturers hide behind. And what it says is that a manufacturer can't be held responsible for their warning, for failing to warn the patient, because there's a learned intermediary in between known as the doctor who's passing on the risks. But if these companies are hiding the risks, they're not being honest about what the true rates of these complaints are, then no surgeon can truly be learned when they're passing on those risks to the patients. And so that's another thing that just has to go, honestly, is this learned intermediary doctrine, because it's a fiction. These surgeons don't know. They have no idea. They're horrified when you actually end up showing them the internal data and the actual adverse event rate that's not cooked. That's the part that we have to get across to surgeons, is that these devices are not what you think they are. They're not approved as safe and effective by FDA. They need to be more learned, and they need to be learned by the literature that's put out there. But again, they cannot be as long as that literature is being skewed.
Well, and certainly anybody watching today that is fixed to get an implant, recently had an implant, or a loved one is, go to the FDA's website and do some research. Google, see if there are lawsuits, because again, those generally reveal the side effects of a lot of this stuff as the front line, and then 2 or 3 years later, we see the recall that says, yeah, all that stuff that they said happened was happening. We don't want this device on the market anymore, or the FDA classifies it a higher level, and then the manufacturers say, well, we can't meet the standards. We'll just take our toys and go home.
Yeah, that's right. And be aware also, Caleb, that the viewers need to know that sometimes manufacturers will apply for an exemption, which allows them a litigation exemption, which allows them to report later. And that can actually skew the adverse event rates as well. And so you're right, looking at lawsuits is critical, because that in some instances, once the lawsuit has begun, you're not going to see the actual adverse event reports that would be reflected otherwise if it weren't for litigation.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show and all that you do for patients and clients around the country. I'm excited to be working with you. I know we've got some trials coming up, and thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be on. Thank you so much, Caleb. Great show.